Okay, good morning. Can you guys see me? I hope so. I have finally figured out how to zoom this into Facebook, I think. So I am not sure if I'm going to be able to see your comments this time because I am still technically challenged. But here we are. I'm really glad that you guys are all here with me this morning. I'm going to be talking about one of my most favorite subjects, which is how have we come to demonize fat in our society, and why is that actually not something that is the right thing to do? So I learned a lot about this subject in my nutritional training. So I'm going to be drawing from that information today. And I'm also going to be drawing from this book right here. It's called The Big Fat Surprise. And it is by an investigative journalist named Nina Tolches. So I have this book obviously in hard copy and on audiobooks. And it is by far one of the best reads you'll ever find if you're like a data nerd like me and you like to know all the research and how scientifically these things came about. I would highly recommend this book. It's available on audiobook also. So before we talk about why, let me just check and make sure that you guys can actually see me on Facebook. Hold on one second. Am I actually live in this group? If you guys can see me, go ahead and give me a comment. Hopefully I am live. Yep, okay. We're just gonna keep on going as if we are live. All right, so before we go over exactly why fat, dietary fat, saturated fat, the kind you find in animal food and a few other places, before we go over why that's actually a good and healthy thing to keep in your nutritional protocols, I want to, thanks Shannon for letting me know you can see me, that's good. I appreciate it. I want to give you guys like some background on how we exactly came to be where we are today. So let me set the stage with a few things that happened nearly turn of the 20th century, right? So early 1900s. We're going to go that far back for a minute because nutritional protocols were different, and scientific studies in part that were done then have been wholly discounted now for reasons that I'll explain. But I think it's important to know these things so that you understand how we came to be in this position. So there was a gentleman by the last name of Stephenson. His first name is, I think he's Swedish. So the first name is Vilhalmar, something like that. We're just going to call him Stephenson. And this was the turn of the 19th century, right? So about 1906, he undertook an exploration experiment and he actually went to the Arctic to live with the tribe called the Inuits in the Canadian Arctic. And in so doing, he committed to essentially living with them, eating the way they did, adopting all of their native habits for the whole period of time that he lived with them. And this particular tribe, they were Eskimos, so they subsisted almost purely on animal fat and milk, both of which contain large amounts of saturated fat and cholesterol. What he found was that particular subset of the population had almost no obesity and no disease whatsoever. They actually consumed the whole animal, nose to tail, as we call it today, including the organs, and they significantly preferred the fattier cuts of meat. In actuality, they fed the leaner cuts of meat, what we often eat today, the muscle meat, they fed it to their dogs because they considered that it was not fit for human consumption because it often led them to be kind of lethargic and not able to hunt the way that they needed to hunt. So Stephenson was so intrigued by this community that when he returned from the Arctic, he actually, himself and a colleague, actually undertook a year-long experiment. In the beginning, they checked themselves into a hospital for medical observation, where they committed to eat nothing but meat and water for 365 days, for a year. And after the first few weeks of medical observation, they were released to their homes because no health issues were found. And at the conclusion of the study, they actually had 0 identified medical health issues, none. And Stephenson himself was so pleased with how he felt and how he looked that he continued to eat that way essentially for the rest of his life. And he passed in the 80s, I believe, which in the early 1900s was quite a long time to be alive. So there is another research scientist. His name is George Mann, and he conducted a similar experiment with the Maasai tribe in Kenya, Africa. And these were very, very lean people, very well recognized to have some of the best fighting warriors that existed at the time. And George Mann conducted his experiment right around the 1950s. And he also went to live with the Maasai tribe and noticed that their warrior elites, the males, all they consumed every day was meat and organs and blood and milk. They specifically were prohibited from eating any kind of vegetable or starchy material. They didn't really even have access to what we call carbohydrates because of their native climate. And they ate so much that every day these men were consuming more than a pound of essentially saturated fat and cholesterol. That was their dietary intake. And as I have just said, George Mann found them to be among the most elite warriors in the world at the time. And they are still today in existence and regarded by people as much the same. They have maintained their isolation really from the nutritional habits of what we would call civilized modern society, right? So they stick to that diet of mostly saturated fat and blood and milk and animal foods, even up until the current day. And in both these studies, despite the arguably high consumption of saturated fat and cholesterol by today's standards, oh no, can you guys still see me? Uh-oh. Let me see. Okay. Good morning, good morning. Okay, Shannon, you can still see me. Great. Okay, so go back. Great. So despite the large amount of fat and cholesterol that these two communities consumed, the blood pressure and weight and overall health of these two tribes were far superior to their American counterparts at the time. They actually displayed a 50% less instance of high blood pressure, obesity, and any other kind of modern disease when compared to their American counterparts. So something, and this extends all the way throughout the ages of these communities. Even in the older men and women, there was still no instance of heart disease, high blood pressure, obesity, anything like that, from a dietary protocol of consuming 60% or more of saturated fat and cholesterol on a regular basis for their entire lives. So that should tell you a few things right off the bat, in that incorporating these things into your nutritional protocols is healthy, and also, more importantly, conditions, modern disease, heart disease, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, obesity, diabetes, all those conditions we suffer from now, they are not an automatic part of the aging process. right? Because if it was the human condition, then no what people ate or how they lived, then everybody would have high blood pressure and high cholesterol and all these diseases, right? And the fact is that they don't. It is almost not exclusively, but it is predominantly a civilized or American type of predicament to have from a health perspective. One more person I want to mention is a dentist, actually. His name is Weston Price, and he was around and conducted his experiments in about the 1930s. And he traveled the globe to various parts of the world, including the Inuit and the Maasai and a few other places, including some Native Americans. And he looked at jaws and people's teeth structure, right? And he wanted to see if he wanted to examine these tribes in their relatively isolated native environment, how they ate and how did their teeth. You can tell a lot, it was his opinion, from about the health of an individual from looking at their teeth and their jaw structure, right? So similar to the other two people, Mann and Stephenson, Dr. Price found that in the Inuits and the Maasai and the Native Americans and other isolated cultures who had remained relatively shut off from the mainland, let's say, from, again, modern food and grains and rice and sugar, their jaws remained very strong and square. The people themselves remained very tall, broad-shouldered, muscular. Their teeth, even without dental care, remained very strong, free from cavities, free from gum disease, free from, again, the modern ailments that inflict most of us. And when he compared the same people, the Inuits, the Native Americans who had migrated to the motherland and started consuming modern diets, including, grains and sugar, over time, and especially over nations, you would see that people's bone structure and their jaws would narrow, their stature would become shorter and narrower with less muscle mass. And all of a sudden they would start displaying a lot of dental decay and cavities and gum disease and various other kinds of medical conditions that are present everywhere in our society now. So that is some of the research that existed around the middle of the 19th century. That's really what was on the scene scientifically at the time, when another gentleman named Ansel Keys came onto the nutrition bandwagon, or onto the scene. What was happening in that time in American society is a bunch of cases of heart disease, men just randomly dying of a heart attack for seemingly inexplicable reasons. The instance of people dying from heart attacks in around the 1950s was significantly less. Like it was a phenomenon that was emerging at the time. It hadn't really happened prior to this point in time in American society. And if you look at what was happening just from an industrial perspective, that was not too long after the Industrial Revolution, when we started kind of mass producing grains and sugars. More about that at another time, because essentially Ansel Keys was a huge force of personality. He was one of those people that could sell ice to an Eskimo, or convince you that the sky was green and the earth is flat if you talk to him for, right? By trade, he was a research biologist, and he really became committed to figuring out why men were dropping dead from heart attacks at a rate never seen before. So his first theory was, okay, it has to be cholesterol. The consumption of dietary cholesterol surely has to be what's causing heart disease, because we all do acknowledge that it is the buildup of plaque caused by cholesterol. That's what clogs your arteries and ultimately leads you to have a heart attack, right? So surely consuming cholesterol was the cause of the buildup of cholesterol in our arteries and ultimately death by heart attack. That was Key's first assumption. However, he rapidly, let me note, in this instance, in this study, he actually did follow a pretty sound scientific protocol when it comes to figuring out whether or not this was a sound hypothesis. I mentioned that because in a subsequent study, he most certainly did not. But for the cholesterol study, when he was trying to prove or disprove his cholesterol hypothesis, he undertook pretty sound scientific research principles. And what he found was actually almost the opposite. He found that he could not feed his test subjects enough cholesterol to cause anything more than a slight increase in blood serum cholesterol, which is the same thing doctors test today. They draw your blood, they look for the cholesterol, and then they give you a number, right? So Keyes, having fed his research subjects like huge amounts of dietary cholesterol, could not, on a 1-to-1 ratio, cause the subject's blood serum cholesterol to raise anything more than a negligible trace amount. And in many instances, he actually found that people's overall cholesterol scores went down. So let's take a little side deviation from the fat topic to just hit the wave tops a little bit about cholesterol and what its role actually is in your body. We'll talk about this more at a later date, but for now, when we are born, right, babies, human babies, if they are breastfed, mother's milk, there are two primary ingredients to mother's milk, and that is fat and cholesterol. Almost exclusively, that is the components of mother's milk. Because of those two things, fat and cholesterol, are critical elements to the development of every cell in our body, particularly our brains. There is something called a myelin sheath around every cell in your body. It's part of the cell membrane, and cholesterol is a key component to maintaining the structure of the cell membrane, to maintaining the integrity of your cells, to controlling what is able to go in and out of every cell in your body to make sure that it keeps bad things out, right? And lets good things in. Cholesterol is a foundational key cofactor to the effective production and regulation of your sex hormones, right? So without adequate levels of cholesterol in your body, all of your reproductive hormones, which are essential for things other than just reproduction, right? Estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, all of those hormones and some others, you're going to have problems effectively producing the correct level of those hormones if you do not have adequate levels of cholesterol in your body. Cholesterol is also responsible for healing, protecting the cell, and also healing inflammation in the body when it occurs. If you have inflammation for whatever reason, your body's response, in addition to some other things, is to surge cholesterol to the site of the inflammation, because, as I just said, cholesterol is protective. It is a protective element for your cell. It's part of maintaining the integrity of every cell membrane. So if something is inflamed, the body recognizes that as a problem and it sends a healing response, which will elevate at the moment in time your blood serum cholesterol, but that's not a bad thing. That is a healing thing. That is a protective thing. The single highest concentration of cholesterol in your body is actually in your brain, largely because of the myelin sheath, the protective nature of the cell membrane and cholesterol's role in maintaining that integrity. So right now, there is a growing and large body of research and holistic and some traditional medical doctors who believe that modern day efforts to lower blood serum cholesterol and restrict the consumption of cholesterol in the diet is actually one of the causes of Alzheimer's and dementia, because you are depriving your body of cholesterol, and so it's not able to effectively maintain the cell membrane's integrity. And so your brain cells become damaged and start to die. And that is one theory for what may be causing the rapidly increasing rate of Alzheimer and dementia that we have in our society right now. So That's just a background on cholesterol. We will come back to that at a later date. Keyes himself ultimately did come, as I said, to discount the theory that dietary cholesterol consumption causes heart disease. So he was still very, very committed to figuring out, okay, well, if it's not dietary cholesterol, Ansel Keys himself, 100% convinced that it was something people were doing, something they were taking in their diet that was causing heart disease. And so he turned his attention to saturated fat, which is the kind of fat primarily found in animal food sources, right? It's your butter, it's your lard, it's the wonderful marbling in a ribeye steak, it's present in salmon. You just think of any kind of animal food source and it's going to contain saturated fat. So that became his second theory, that if it's not cholesterol, then surely it must be the excessive consumption of saturated fat that is causing heart disease to go on the rise. Because he looked around, and at the time in the 50s, this is most of our grandparents or great grandparents' generation, what did people cook with and eat at the time? They cooked with bacon grease and butter and lard, and they ate all the eggs and all the meat and all the wonderful things, right? So clearly that had to be the cause of the rise in heart disease, or so thought Keyes. Unlike his cholesterol study, he was so convicted of the truth of this hypothesis that even before he had the scientific data to back up these assertions, he started speaking to his colleagues and to prominent members in society and the media as if this was a factual foregone conclusion. When he spoke about the trials he was conducting, he spoke about them not as if they were a hypothesis, but as if they were fact. And remember what I said about the force of personality of this man. He was also a very well-connected figure in society. One of his best friends was President Eisenhower's personal physician, and that will come into play in just a minute. So what he did is he looked at data around the globe from about 22 different countries. At the time, there were 22 different countries who had also themselves been undertaking a study on what causes heart disease. And these included data from the two tribes we just mentioned earlier, the Inuits and the Maasai, and also the Native Americans and several other subsets of society. But when Keyes was reviewing this data and structuring his own studies, essentially he cherry-picked the data of the existing studies that matched his current hypothesis. And that is research bias, right? That is absolutely not what you're supposed to do when you're conducting a scientific trial, right? You have a hypothesis and you conduct an unbiased study to either prove or disprove the hypothesis. And if you find generally one or more instances where a trial goes the opposite of what you supposed, then the hypothesis is seemingly on its face disproven. However, Keyes completely disregarded that basic scientific principle in everything that he did in the 50s and 60s. Unfortunately, at the time, President Eisenhower himself had a heart attack. And as I just mentioned, Ansel Keys and the president's personal doctor were besties. So the president's personal doctor, in treating the president, he actually had multiple heart attacks. In treating the president's condition and in reporting his efforts on the president's health and to improve the president's health, this doctor was very public in the media about efforts, which President Eisenhower became like a devout follower of a low-fat diet. And this message was broadcast from the White House. It was then broadcast throughout all the major news outlets at the time. It was certainly broadcast throughout the scientific community by Ansel Keys himself. And with those three things in combination, this diet heart hypothesis, which to this moment in time has never been more than a hypothesis, because Ansel Keys was never able to conduct a pure, unbiased clinical trial that actually proved anything more than a correlation between the consumption of saturated fat and the instances of heart disease. Some 25 years later, after the 50s and 60s, Ansel Keys actually would go back and re-examine the data from the previous 20 years. Let me say, though, what I started to say a second ago, the convergence of those three things, right? Ansel Keys' force of personality and the way that he vehemently defended his position and spoke as if it was fact. And in so doing, because of his connections in the White House, anybody who spoke against him their research grants were pulled. They were essentially shut out from doing what every good scientist wants to do, which is have funding to conduct research to prove or disprove hypothesis. So it was a unilateral silencing of any voice of objection at the time by Ansel Keys himself in partnership with the White House, and ultimately in partnership with the American Heart Association and Big Pharma that was coming on scene at the time. All these organizations were created essentially as a result of Eisenhower's multiple heart attacks and in cooperation with Keys and the president's personal physician. So there's a whole bunch more information on all of that in this book. But what you need to take away for this broadcast, this teaching moment, is that this concept that heart disease, dietary fat, saturated fat causes heart disease has never been anything more than a hypothesis. As I was saying, some 20 or 30 years later, Ansel Keys himself went back, and I believe George Mann did too, and they looked at the data from the 1950s or 60s when they started collecting the data up to, what are we now, the 80s or 90s? They looked back at all the men that they had studied over time, and they actually found a reduced correlation. Like they could not tie a direct line correlation between consumption of dietary fat and incidence of heart disease. In fact, what they saw in these men that they had studied was an increase in what we call all-cause mortality. So they could not really say after 30 years that consumption of dietary fat caused heart disease. They could not. But what they could say is that having now changed to a low-fat diet for the better part of the past 30 years, these men were dying in general at a higher rate. And they were dying from things that still plague us to this day. They were dying from obesity. They were dying from diabetes. They were dying from cancer. Because when you remove saturated fat in your diet, you have to replace it with something else. And the something else, if you want your food to taste anything better than cardboard, the something else that you add is going to be sugar and carbohydrates. There was another study done in that same time frame, the 80s and 90s, about the influence of sugar on the body's inflammatory response and the instances of heart attack and heart disease and coronary artery disease and all things associated with the heart and its proper functions. And we're going to talk about the role of sugar in the diet also at a later date. Okay, I'm going to pause there and see if I can see. I'm going to check my notes and see if I can take a look at your comments and questions and see if you have them. If you have anything, let me look real quick. Okay. Okay, I'm going to refresh my screen. Okay, I don't think I see any questions at this moment. If you have any, just type them into the chat. Type them into the chat just to say hi too. If you want to say good morning, Sabrina, Shannon, I see you. Thanks for saying hi. All right, so I think for the most part, I'm going to wrap up this morning with a couple just clarifying comments. Let me be clear that when we talk about fat, right, it's a very unfortunate circumstance that it's the same word. Dietary fat, body fat, we call them both fat, right? Unfortunately, they're not the same thing at all. What causes your body to hold on to fat? or to build fat, right? So body fat is called adipose tissue. It's basically your body's response when it can't store all the things that you're consuming, and it has to like push it into cells or create new cells because you're consuming too much of something and your body can't process it out. So when we consume fat, dietary fat, that turns into fatty acids. And when we consume protein, for the most part, that turns into amino acids. Both those things, the body is incapable of storing for the most part. It essentially flushes it out. You excrete it by urination or defecation every time. So if you consume large amounts of dietary fat or protein, your body it can't shove those things into your cells. It's just going to pass it out if it can't uptake and use it. The same is not true for sugar and carbohydrates. And let's be clear, essentially anything that's not dietary fat or protein, your body will turn into sugar, glucose on the inside, whether it's a Snickers bar, a banana, broccoli, a sweet potato, whatever, all those things on the inside, your body converts to glucose. So your body can store up to a certain amount of glucose in your cells and in the layers that surround your organs. And the way that your body does that is it releases insulin, and insulin goes, knocks on your cell door and says, hey, there's too much glucose in my bloodstream cell. You need to take some of this up. And so the cell's like, okay. And then your cells expand, right? Now we have extra adipose tissue, extra body fat, because the insulin is forcing in the insulin is forcing the extra glucose into the cells. And as a side note, we'll talk about this more later too, your cells can only hold so much extra glucose. Over time, the cells become less and less responsive to insulin's knock, and they start to be like, nope, insulin, I'm full. That is a condition that we call metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance, which are both the precursors to diabetes, which diabetes at root level is the cell's inability to take up extra glucose and the body's inability to regulate appropriately its own blood sugar, because your cells become resistant to insulin's knock, right? So that's how body fat and insulin resistance and diabetes actually happen. It is from excessive glucose present in your body, not excessive dietary fat or protein present in your body. So in closing, we'll go into more details in those subjects over time as well. In closing, I also wanted to point out that this trifecta of messaging, right, from Ansel Keys and the scientific community, from the White House via the president's personal doctor, and down into mainstream media at the time, and the creation of various different organizations that coincided with the, industrial and agricultural revolution and the advent of big pharma, right? These things all just took the country by storm. They just took hold at the root foundational level of our society, and they remain present to this day. Because let me ask you a series of questions in closing, just for you to think about. Who would financially benefit? Like, if human beings were able to control and in many cases reverse their medical conditions purely with diet, with nutritional changes, nutritional and lifestyle changes, where's the money in that? Do you need to take a pill to treat various modern medical diseases if you do not actually have those diseases anymore? The lovely food pyramid that we have, right? Who creates that food pyramid? I would challenge you to go look, and I'm fairly certain that you will find it is the US Department of Agriculture, in conjunction with the Food and Drug Administration, that publish the food pyramid and the dietary guidelines for this country. So let's think about, what are the motivations behind those groups? It is the Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration that produces those guidelines, right? So just consider on your own what their real motivation is in recommending the things that they recommend. Is it really for the overall health of the everyday human being? Or could there be financial motivation that exists behind the scenes? Ultimately, your health is always in your own hands, and every individual has to choose for themselves what they think the best course of action is going to be. Lastly, I will say that many of you have reached out to me saying, Rebecca, these so much great information in all these live trainings, but how do I implement these things in my own lifestyle? And I wanted to just briefly share with you that I have a 6-week program in development that I will be sharing more information and details with you guys about in the coming weeks. It is a 6-week program designed to break the yo-yo diet and exercise phenomenon that many of us have been plagued with our entire lives. And in this program, we will basically focus on the foundations of health, the similar topics that we've been talking about in these lives, but in much more personalized and detailed fashion. And in the coming weeks, I will share with you more details about that program. I am hoping to launch it and present it to all of you guys for participation with the start date of May 1st. So there will be about 10 or 15 spots that I'm going to offer for run of this program. So if you're interested, let me know. Otherwise, stay tuned for more details about that in the coming weeks. And as always, I wanted to say thank you so much for listening to me this morning. I hope this time is a little bit better for everybody. I do feel for sure it's better for me. And if you have any friends that you think would benefit from the group and the information we're all sharing and learning together here, then please don't hesitate to invite them along. And I hope you all have a beautiful weekend and wonderful weeks. If I've missed any comments, because I haven't really been able to see them too clearly this morning, I'm going to go back now and address any comments and questions. And hopefully, if you haven't been able to join me live and you're on the replay, comment then, and I'll pay attention to this feed as the week goes on and get to any questions you guys might have. But have a lovely Saturday, my warriors, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.